Darlene, welcome to the Matt Pfeiffer Experience. We are honored to have you. And if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into it and where you're at now.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Matt, for inviting me to speak to your audience. And as you mentioned, I've been counseling people for over 30 years. And before that, I was an entertainment attorney.
Oh,
Wasn't very
wow.
happy. Yeah, wasn't very happy practicing law. And then eventually I remembered and got back to my roots. I always wanted to be a psychologist and an author. And I went back to school midlife and got my degree. And I've been doing this in 2000. It was about 2011. I was contacted by Wiley Publications that asked me to write Codependency for Dummies,
Hmm.
which is behind me on my
Yeah,
right,
we see it.
your left, or something. And after that came out, Hazelden liked it. They do a lot of publications in the addiction field, and they asked me to write Conquering Shame and Codependency, which is on my left up there.
Mhm.
There.
Yep.
That was in around 2014. And since then, a second edition of the Dummies book came out. And I published a book dealing with a narcissist, which was a ebook in 2015. And it was very popular. And many people wanted me to write a paperback. So I finally got around to it. And this year, published, can't really see the title over here, Dating, Loving, and Leaving a Narcissist.
Hmm.
Essential tools for improving or leaving, can't really see the words very good, narcissistic and abusive relationships.
Hmm.
And it's much more up to date. It's 3 times longer than the ebook, and has a lot of new research, and it covers a broader area, dating all the way to leaving. So that's been my most recent project.
That is
Mhm.
absolutely amazing. And once again, I absolutely love your work, and you're always spot on when it comes to codependency. And tell us, how did you? Oftentimes, I tell people that when you get into talking about codependency and narcissism, you typically back into it. It's rare, very rare. Maybe this is your situation, that you go to school and you decide that, yeah, I want to work with codependents and I want to work with people who are coming out of narcissistic relationships. Was it something that you intentionally did for a reason, or did you feel like it was kind of like a calling for you, or how did you get into it?
Oh, no, it was very different. I had been married to an alcoholic, and it was an abusive relationship. And then I went to 12-step program for many years and did a lot of work in recovery myself.
Hmm.
So I did my own recovery in codependency. And when I wrote Codependency for Dummies, I thought, well, probably a lot of people in relationships with addicts would contact me,
Hmm.
because the the whole concept of codependency arose out of research with alcoholics and addicts. And even Hazelton, asked me to write that book, and they serve the addiction industry. But lo and behold, all these people started contacting me who were in relationships with narcissists who didn't drink even. A lot of
Hmm.
them didn't even drink. And there was a big hunger for information on that. So I started responding to what people needed and started writing more about it, and got more interested and did more research. And I have a narcissistic mother,
Hmm.
and so I have narcissism in my family. So I have a lot of firsthand um, experience with it too. So it really set me up for codependency and marrying someone who is abusive.
Absolutely. I talk about the links with addiction and people who are in narcissistic relationships all the time. When people who follow me know my story, the fact that I started out as a substance use therapist before I converted and transitioned to
Mhm.
where I'm at now. And that's where I learned a lot of terminology and learned a lot of the about the relationship between people who struggle with codependency and narcissism and that sort of thing as well. there's a lot of links between, and quite often a lot of people who struggle with an addiction may also be comorbid with with a cluster B personality disorder and that sort of thing as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I had an argument with my editor at Hazelton because my definition of codependency that's in the Dummies book would include substance users
Hmm.
or addicts in general. And he said, well, how can that be? Because codependents are in relationship with addicts. So how could the addicts also be codependent? He was thinking very concretely. I said, no, it's underneath all addiction.
Hmm.
And I was reading an article the other day that was saying it's the mother of all addiction.
Yeah.
So I'm in the minority, but there is research also to justify that narcissists are codependent too.
Hmm.
If you take out the idea of self-sacrifice
Hmm.
in my symptomology and the core symptoms, I don't see self-sacrifice as a core symptom of codependency. There are different types of codependence. Abusers and addicts can be codependent. They could be bullies and be codependent, but they may not be sacrificing. But they use other forms of control. So
Hmm.
actually, people pleasing is kind of a passive way to control people, and an abuser might do it more directly or try to control themselves or
Yeah.
be out of control. They just have dysfunctional relationship with control. So yeah, narcissists, they're very dependent on
Hmm.
other people's affirmation and approval, and they have such emptiness inside also, like codependence, and they need to fill that up with their get their narcissistic needs met from other people. And codependents do that by giving and trying to get love and from other people too. So it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship.
Hmm.
But my experience in being married to an addict and then recovering and working on myself for many years is that I started changing the power dynamic in that relationship. And what I discovered is the same principles apply in a relationship with a narcissist. Because when you start taking your power back, they kind of fall apart because their whole facade of being powerful and in control and being a bully is really a cover up for shame underneath.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Shame and insecurity and
Mhm.
all
Exactly.
of it. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I talk to people about, and I'm definitely want to touch on people pleasing here in a second as well. And I want to share an interesting story with you to get your thoughts. But I want to get your definition of codependency first, because oftentimes one of the things I kind of challenge people with is that oftentimes we have terminology, sometimes like something like gaslighting, we kind of toss it around, but really people don't have the foundational piece of really actually knowing what it is. What's your most pure definition of what codependency actually is?
Well, I thought deep and hard about it when I wrote my book, and there is no one universal definition. So this is my own, and it also overlaps with some other theorists too, but I see it as an illness or a disorder of the self. You can think of a codependent as a lost self. And even I was just reading some more recent research, and they interviewed a lot of codependents. And one thing that was clear, they all felt like they had, like they were chameleons, like they didn't have a strong self concept. It's like they wanted to fit in with whoever they were with, whatever social experience or setting or person that they were with. They wanted to be accepted and loved or liked by that person. And so they adapted. When I met my husband, I said, I'm very adaptable. I guess I thought that was a good trait.
Hmm.
So chameleon is typical. So that's an indication of having not being connected to your true self. I call it like a lost self. You have it, but it's buried, often under shame.
Hmm.
So my definition is someone whose thinking and behavior who can't access their innate self, and their thinking and behavior revolves around a person, a substance, or a process. So a process would be like gambling or sex addiction, shopping, another kind of addiction that's a behavior versus a substance.
I want to talk about people pleasing. You hit the nail on the head. I want to share an interesting story with you. I mentioned, I know you and I are linked together on LinkedIn, and I shared one time that people pleasing behavior uh, has elements of not in a malicious way, but it can be manipulative. I shared that on TikTok, and people wanted to have my head.
A hidden form of trying to influence someone.
Hmm.
So, but you could think of it as hostile,
Hmm.
where it's really aggressive, um, like a narcissist might do. Or it just might be trying to influence somebody indirectly to do what you want.
Hmm.
So, for instance, someone who acts like a victim, you could think of a codependent might do this, or a narcissist too. Just complain, oh, I don't have a ride, who's going to take care of my child? I need a babysitter and I can't, blah, 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 and all this complaining, hoping because they can't ask directly,
Hmm.
you know, typically a codependent feels too ashamed to ask for their needs.
Hmm.
So they'll just complain and hoping that you'll like loan them money, give them a ride, babysit, or whatever it is that they need, rather than just come out and ask you and be direct about it. Their
Yeah.
communication's dysfunctional. So that's an example of a kind of a passive manipulation. It's not people pleasing, but it's complaining, acting like a victim, and then hoping that you'll take care of them. So people pleasing also could be gift given to get someone to like you. Um, I think the difference is if you feel like you can say no to somebody, that's different than someone who's a compulsively pleasing.
Hmm.
Well, we're crossing over to another subject, people pleasing as a compulsion versus whether it's manipulation, because codependents have a hard time saying no
Hmm.
as a
Go ahead.
communication.
You can. Yeah, you can go ahead and go into
Yeah.
that
So
direction
that
with
so it
compulsion as
becomes
well.
so if you decide to please someone because you genuinely want to help them or you care about them, uh, and you think about the pros and cons and you decide to go ahead, that's just being kind. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it becomes a compulsion and you can't say no, then you have to think about, why are you doing this? Is it really out of caring, or is it just because you're out of fear,
Hmm.
that you can't, or that you're doing it so that you'll get something in return?
Hmm.
So, I mean, people do that all the time, also in business and in other situations where it's a give and take. That's a little different than really pleasing for, well, maybe you could say it's manipulative.
Hmm.
So uh, anyway, but
Well,
codependents do it to a fault where they're not even conscious of it
mhm.
and they can't say no. So it's a compulsion.
One of the things that you hear codependents and people pleasers say a lot is that I just want everyone to be happy. What is that all about? And what in for a lot of people when they say that they don't see where the problem lies with wanting everyone to be happy. What's that all about?
Well, that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Um, because they don't want to make waves, and so they waive their rights. They don't have boundaries. And that's another example of pleasing everybody else. And you can't please everybody all the time. And, the worst for a codependent is getting a situation where two people want opposite things. Maybe their husband is sick and they wants the wife to stay home and take care of him, and her mother it's her birthday.
Mhm.
So should she stay home with her husband, go to her mother's party? She wouldn't consider, what do I want to do? There's no, so making everybody happy, you lose yourself.
Mhm.
So that gets back to what I said about not having a self. Yourself doesn't enter into the equation in making decisions. If I'm going to please somebody, why am I trying to make everybody happy? And there's also the fear of conflict,
Mhm.
conflict avoidance. Not all codependents. I mean, a narcissist and some bullies, they like to provoke conflict. Um, some addicts do too. But there's the kind of codependent that is uh, the typical, stereotypical, that just wants to adapt. They don't want to make waves.
Mhm.
And a narcissist, by the way, he doesn't care about that. He he wants to get ahead.
Mhm.
And the codependent wants to get along. So they're on a different track.
Yeah, I really
And
like that. The narcissist wants to get ahead, then the codependent wants to get along.
so a lot of my book is that you have to really understand the mindset of the
Mhm.
narcissist and play it, instead of trying to mold the narcissist and keep trying to get them to behave the way you want them to, like trying to turn a cat into a dog or something like that.
Mhm.
You're not going to be able to do that. So you have to understand who you're dealing with and change the way you communicate and change your expectations. People are always saying to me, like, I did so much for my wife. I
Mhm.
waited on her. I did whatever she wanted. And I asked one thing, and she can't be found. She can't be bothered. She's too busy.
Mhm.
So they're measuring their expectations against what they would do. I would never do that to somebody.
Mhm.
They're acting as if the narcissist is a normal brain. Well, they don't. They think differently, and their brain works differently. So you have to understand who you're dealing with.
One of the things that happens a lot with codependents is that I notice that they get very confused because on one hand, they say and they think that I'm very good. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to be the bad guy. I don't want to be the villain. But then we also have the other side where because their needs aren't being met, the resentment builds up. And then all of a sudden, boom, we have these resentment pops. And I think that's something that a
Mhm.
lot of people who struggle with codependency fail to realize is that you actually are setting boundaries. You're just doing it in a very unhealthy way.
Mm.
Can you talk a little bit about resentment and codependence and what that looks like for you?
Yeah, that's right. I wrote a blog called Anger and Resentment. And it's expectations, I guess, are the seeds of resentment. So um, codependents have a lot of resentment for a lot of reasons. One is denial. So I mentioned a form of denial where you're thinking like a narcissist is going to act a certain way, or you're thinking an alcoholic is going to keep their promises and get sober, or so. If you have the denial about the person you're dealing with and having expectations that are unreasonable or that they haven't met in the past, why would you think that they're going to suddenly act differently?
Exactly.
So that is going to lead to resentments. So that's number one. If you keep giving and self-sacrificing, your needs aren't going to get met. If you have trouble asking for your needs, you're going to be resentful. Um, so if you keep pleasing, if you don't have boundaries, you don't say no. Relationships require boundaries. You can't have love without boundaries. There are conditions. And if you accept unacceptable behavior or abuse, and if you accept it, you're endorsing it, you're allowing it, and you'll have resentments about those. So those are some ways that lead people's behavior that leads to resentment. If you're not speaking up, if you have a resentment, well, here's another thing. A lot of codependents, because they have shame underneath it all, I wrote a whole book about shame. Um, it's a core symptom and it can lead to codependency due to trauma. So oftentimes, their natural anger has been shame. Either their parents would say, don't talk back, don't raise your voice, you're not allowed to get angry, or maybe for religious reasons, you're not allowed to get angry. And so once that natural expression is shamed, then it goes underground. And you might even attract your shadow, attract the angry person because you're not in touch with your own anger.
Wow.
So you attract what you disown, you attract. So if you're selfless, you're going to attract someone who's selfish. And you think they're so selfish. Well, you're too selfless. I
Mhm.
actually had a dream once that I needed to be more narcissistic.
Mhm.
So there's such a thing as healthy narcissism,
Mhm.
and codependents need a dose of that.
In the meantime, I want to touch on that nugget that you just dropped, and I talk to people about healthy doses of narcissism because and people are like, whoa, 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 what is that? Right? What is a healthy dose of narcissism? Because I think that's one of those narcissism is one of those terms, and again, that just gets tossed around and it has such a negative connotation. And so when you say healthy dose of narcissism, what does that look like for someone?
Well, you value yourself. You
Hmm.
have good self-esteem and not inflated, but realistic. And you can be a leader. You pursue your goals. You have boundaries. You value yourself. And it's kind of like the goal of recovery. So you can pursue your passions and you won't take disrespect from anyone. Uh, Oprah may be an example of
Do
healthy
codependents
narcissism.
also struggle with the desire to be perfect?
Yep. And I wrote a book on that. So
Hmm.
I've written 10 books. All
Hmm.
my books are workbooks. So it's not just to read, there's exercises. And I have one like, I'm not perfect, I'm just human, how
Hmm.
to overcome perfectionism. And it's a workbook. And perfectionism is defense to shame. The idea is if I'm perfect, then I'm beyond reproach. It's one thing to strive for your best, but um, perfectionists take it to an extreme and they evaluate themselves, their self-esteem based on how they perform. So
Hmm.
and it becomes a compulsion. They can't stop themselves. So they may think they made a mistake at work and over the weekend, and then they drive back to the office and they have to correct it. They think they make mistakes when they didn't. They take longer to do things because they're trying to be perfect. Um, and they have a lot of false beliefs like, if I'm not perfect, I won't be successful. If I'm
Hmm.
not perfect, I won't be liked, or I won't be loved, or I won't be happy. So I list a list of false beliefs that they live by, these beliefs.
Something I see with people who struggle with perfectionism as well is that they either won't take on a task because of the fear of failure, or they just completely quit in the middle of it because
Absolutely.
that pressure of being perfect all the time just is insurmountable. And so there, it also comes with the fear of failure, which we just mentioned, but also a fear of success. That what if I actually achieve it and then I can't maintain it because there's so much pressure to try to maintain perfectionism. So do you think is there some elements of self-sabotage that comes with that as well?
Oh, absolutely. And you're very accurate in what you said. So there's a lot of procrastination. And so they don't want to look foolish. They think I had a client once who thought she should know everything before she learned it.
Hmm.
She was afraid to learn
Mhm.
anything. And it started in childhood. Every time she would go into the next grade, she was afraid of failing and thought she had to know everything.
Mhm.
So there was no um, allowance for making mistakes. I mean, a baby wouldn't learn to walk if they didn't fall down.
Right.
And we're kind of trained, we clap and we're so proud of the baby taking a step. Well, you have to treat yourself that way. And then Toscanini was well known for his perfectionism, and he had such an amazing ear for music that he could hear if like the fourth violin was a half a note off, and he was just ruthless in rehearsal. And if it wasn't perfect, he would cancel the performance,
Mhm.
even though like thousands of people had bought tickets. So that's an extreme. And there are different types of perfectionism. So there's positive perfectionism, where people do strive to be perfect and they expect to succeed, and that propels them to do better. And if they don't, they look for external reasons too. Well, it wasn't just that I'm a failure. Maybe the test was too hard, or they reflect on maybe I need to study more or prepare more for this presentation or whatever it is. Then there's a negative perfectionism, and they're they sabotage themselves the most because they expect to fail. And so then they more often do fail. So they might procrastinate, not study as much, not prepare as much. And when they don't succeed, then they go into a shame spiral, and then they don't want to, try again. So it's the opposite. So at least you could try to change your perfectionism into from negative to positive. And that negative often starts in childhood. And some of it can be modeled by parents or even hereditary in some cases. So,
For the people who are listening, and someone that might be listening online or watching us right now, that are saying to themselves, "Yeah, this sounds like me. I struggle with codependency," or maybe they knew before even listening to this. What are some first steps that they can get that ball rolling in terms of healing codependency and correcting their behavior, so they can have better relationships with themselves and with other people moving forward?
well, first of all, get all the information you can. I'd recommend reading and doing the exercises in my book, Codependency for Dummies. Join Codependents Anonymous. And one of the biggest obstacles to in recovery is shame. And even myself, I didn't realize I had shame at the time. And when I realized it, I went back into therapy and did a lot of work on it. So start paying attention to your negative self-talk, because you can have a very hostile, controlling inner critic that sabotages you. So I always say this: write down your negative self-talk, and that includes shoulds. Codependents are always shooting on themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So write it down, and just doing that will be helpful. Another thing you can do is start journaling. That's very helpful. Try to identify your feelings and needs. A lot of codependents are not in touch with their feelings, and even more not in touch with their needs, especially emotional needs, because
Mm-hmm.
they weren't met in childhood, so they don't even know them or value them. And then the next step is meeting those needs. Actually, on my website, whatiscodependency.com, I have like 9 images. It's a slider, and each one is a step in recovery. So I list like 9 steps of recovery right on my website.
That's absolutely amazing. Darlene, this has been absolutely fantastic. You are an absolute wealth of
Mhm.
knowledge. I've been following you for so long.
Oh, really?
You've helped me personally
Oh,
and professionally as well. And I share your content with everyone. If you could just take some time out and tell us a little bit more about your work and some books that you would recommend that you've written, and your articles, and so people can have some resources. And we'll definitely share those in the show notes as well.
okay. Well, I mentioned Codependency for Dummies. That would be a starter. If you already know something about codependency, if you started working on yourself a little bit, or if you're aware that you carry around shame, I would go to my second book, Conquering Shame and Codependency. And don't read it quickly, read it slowly, and try to identify with what I wrote. Do some journaling while you're doing it. 1/3 of the book is exercises. If you have a narcissist in your family, or if you're in love with one, or have a child or a parent or a sibling or colleague, friend that's a narcissist, that book will help you know how to get your needs met, how to improve the relationship, or prepare you to leave. So, not everybody wants to leave a relationship, they want to improve it. And when I work with people, they do make progress in either improving the relationship or leaving the relationship if they decide to do that. So, and I don't want to fail to mention, I mentioned my website. I have another one, darlenelancer.com. And I'm all over social media and Instagram. It's Darlene Lancer, LMFT. I have a YouTube channel. I have a lot of podcasts on the media page of my website. And I also tell people, this is, you should remember,
Yep, I
take
remember
a
this one now.
Q-tip,
Hmm.
that acronym. Quit taking when people say things. It's not about you, it's about them.
Yeah.
And I have this cup. It says, remember Q-tip.
Yep.
And the other side says, quit taking it personally. You can get it on my website. So I think that's fun. So you can remind yourself with your morning tea or
Yep.
coffee.
I'm definitely going to remember that. I'm definitely going to share that with people. And so we appreciate you so much. This has been
Thank you.
absolutely amazing. I know that a lot of people have learned so much, and so thank you for your time.